Hi, Ken, and thanks for joining us today. I wanted to open up with a pretty outright question for you, and it's something that came on our discovery call together. So, in roughly 45 days, there was three major acquisitions in the space. Philips bought BioTelemetry for 2.8 billion, I believe. Boston Scientific bought Preventice, and Hillrom moved on Bardy for 375 million. So that was three of the four biggest players in the cardiac path monitoring space, I guess. And, you was inside Bardi when this happened. What did this period feel like?
Yeah, so I had commercialized iRhythm first and built the sales and marketing teams, which launched that product. They eventually went public, and so from there I went to BioTelemetry and built out some of the sales teams that launched their real time and non real time patches. And so I've been talking to strategics for 10 plus years, trying to get them interested in the space and to buy one of the companies in the space. And so for that to happen where, one was getting acquired and then two more went in rapid succession, I always kind of felt because it made sense for the cardiac rhythm management players that if one went, then at least one more would go in fairly rapid succession. I didn't think three of the four biggest players would go that quickly in a 45-day period, but it was really nice just to see that all that hard work that so many people put into the space and growing out the patch monitoring space, to see that the bigger strategics were that interested, that three of the four biggest players in the world got acquired in that time period was really fantastic and felt great that I'd made the right choice in leaving the pacemaker world to go into cardiac monitoring.
And what do you think was the domino effect that caused this? You know, these acquisitions don't happen overnight. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. So there must have been something going on behind
Yes.
closed doors.
Yeah, so there's so many dynamics here that were at play. So there was a period of time that myself and the leadership team at Bardy, we tried to bring Preventice and Bardy together. We were going to bring the combined companies together and then eventually do an IPO of the combined companies. That took maybe a year and a half and then kind of fell apart. My guess is that it fell apart because Boston Scientific and Merck's Innovation Fund, they owned a big portion of Preventice, and they probably couldn't agree on did that make sense to bring the companies together and then bring the combined company public. That's my guess. And so in the background, Philips and Boston Scientific were really looking closely at biotelemetry. They were looking at some of the other players too, but biotelemetry, Preventice, they kind of went back and forth as to which company they wanted to acquire. And so when one of them pulled the trigger, can't remember if it was, I think Philips moved first on biotelemetry. And then shortly after, it may have been the reverse, but shortly after Boston Scientific moved on Preventice. And then, 45, within that 45-day period, about, at the tail end of that, Hillrom announced the acquisition of Bardy Diagnostics. So really phenomenal period of time for that space, and really proud to have been a part of building three of the four biggest players in that space.
Amazing. And I don't believe all of it went smoothly though. I believe there was an issue that ended up well, it was with Medicare, I believe. Maybe you could tell me a
Yeah,
little about that.
sure. So yeah, on the backs or the Hillrom, and just to kind of clarify, Baxter bought the combined company of Hillrom and Bardy,
Right.
so later. So that was also dynamic at play. But what happened, which potentially would have killed the Bardy Hillrom deal, is that Medicare made a mistake in the reimbursement code. So what everyone thought was going to be a 35% increase in the reimbursement rates, Medicare came out and mistakenly decreased by 85% the reimbursement rate, and Hillrom eventually tried to back out of the acquisition. Barty took Hillrom to court. It was somewhat of a mess, but in the end, it all worked out. Hillrom acquired Barty. He's really happy with that acquisition, and everybody on all sides was happy.
Amazing. And And with this kind of thing, how quickly could that have sunk the business if this issue had continued?
Yeah, and so that it didn't get reversed for quite a while, and in fact, it took, I think, over a year for it to get fully fixed, but it took however many months for Medicare to increase the reimbursement somewhat, and then I think it was roughly a year or so to where it brought the reimbursement back to where it should have been, which if we weren't in the process of getting acquired, who knows what would have happened to the company, but it probably killed some of the smaller startups along the way or really significantly hurt them, because of that reimbursement change. So it's just one of those things that can sometimes happen. Mistakes happen, and sometimes major mistakes happen, and this was one of them, which could have killed the acquisition.
And just how close was it to killing the acquisition?
Oh, we had to take them to court, and so, I mean, they literally backed out of the acquisition, and so Barty had to take Hillrom to court and eventually won in court, and there was a general counsel, named Mark Hanfeld on the Barty side that was just phenomenal, had a amazing track record at Wilson Sonsini before, coming to Barty. In fact, he was on the team that fought, Lance Armstrong for doping. He probably doesn't want me telling that story and put it out there just because I 'cause I'm very proud of the guy. He's a phenomenal lawyer, and he did great things for Barty.
That's incredible. And yeah, nice little shout out for him there. I want to actually go back a step then. So we sort of alluded to this at the start, and let's talk a little bit about your career then. So you commercialized some pretty amazing businesses in the space. Let's talk about say Boston Scientific onwards. What got you into the cardiovascular space and what's kept you there?
Yeah, so I actually was in finance coming out of college. So I went to boarding school called Phillips Exeter up in New Hampshire. After being a public school kid my entire life, my last 2 years I went to boarding school, and then went to Vanderbilt and was a finance and business administration major. And came out, went to Atlanta, worked for a couple Fortune 100 companies on the finance side. And then the catalyst for me completely changing careers and wanting to get into sales, and get into the pacemaker business was really 9/11. I'd grown up with New York being kind of the biggest city close to us and going up into the Twin Towers, with my 4 brothers, and grandparents a lot for special occasions, birthdays, and such. And so when that happened, I remember distinctly watching the first tower had been hit and then watching a live stream the plane fly into the second tower, which anybody who experienced that, and especially if you watched it live stream or you were there and a part of it, it just is such a impactful event on our lives, something we'll never forget. And for me, I had this epiphany of, what am I doing sitting in a cubicle doing finance and operations and just not really feeling like I was making an impact on the world. And so I remember reaching out to my older brother and asking what could I do in the medical world. He was in medical sales that I could feel like I was a part of impacting, improving, and saving lives. And he told me to look at the orthopedic space and the cardiac space. And when I did that research and I learned what a pacemaker did and what an implantable defibrillator did, I got really passionate and somewhat obsessed with wanting to go work for one of the implantable pacemaker defibrillator companies because what I was told is you could be in the procedure with the physician, be a part of the implant, and you could actually experience some of those patients either getting better or who'd been shocked and brought back to life and really life-saving devices, the implantable defibrillators. And so eventually convinced Guidant to hire me. They brought me in first on the finance side, built good relationships with sales and sales leadership, and then eventually got some offers to come out into the field. I got an offer from a guy named Sean Burke to come out to Charleston. Sean now runs sales for Boston Scientific, I think on the either the electrophysiology side or cardiac rhythm management side for the whole US. And then the other person was a guy named Roger Owens who recruited me out to Dallas. And at the time, my wife was from Dallas. and was pregnant with our first child, and roughly 8 months pregnant. So we ended up in Dallas in 2005, and have been in Dallas ever since. So yeah, that's how I got into the cardiac device world.
Well,
Typical, not a typical way to get it. I had no sales experience, by the way, and
very
eventually to hire me would give me a shot.
straight into a new world and a completely different environment. So no, that's very typical of you. You then went on to some massive successes. You know, you've built the commercial teams with some of the biggest players in the space now.
No.
What do you think was the thing that you kept doing differently, that you found when you arrived? So there must have been playbooks that you wanted to change and adapt.
Yeah, so, I really owe a lot to Guidant and then Boston Scientific after the acquisition of Guidant. They had unbelievable mentors, they had an unbelievable management development program, and so I just got lucky that they focused on people and culture and really drove that home significantly, and I took that to every company I've been either worked for or been involved with since, is that focus on people, bringing in the right people, developing those people, and trying to keep that culture strong is just so important to building a good sales organization, and a good company overall. That I took all of those learnings and everything I learned from the mentors over to these startups, and really that was the foundation for the teams that I built at iRhythm, at CardioNet, which became BioTelemetry, and then at Bardy Diagnostics. So they really owe a lot to Guidant and Boston Scientific.
And what do you think a lot of these companies that you entered were getting wrong, and generally just med tech
Mm.
startups in the space?
Yeah, so really good question. I think in every situation, so I was never a founder of these companies. I got brought in when they were early commercialization or had been failing at commercialization to really reevaluate what they were doing, look at the teams they'd built, look at the profile of rep that they'd hired, look at the culture they were building, look at the comp plan they developed, were they driving the right behaviors, et cetera, and really rethink what they were doing and relaunch the products. And in all of those cases, we strengthened the team, we strengthened the culture, and within a couple year period, we had significant sales traction, sales adoption, and we're hitting our numbers consecutively quarter after quarter. And so you can take BioTelemetry as an example. They were the stock had been at $2 a share for 3 years. They'd had 3 years in a row of declining sales. Turnover of the sales team was something like 45% when I got brought in. And I just started to bring in the right people, build the right culture, put the right comp plan in place, and obviously the leadership in the organization obviously helped with the CEOs that were involved and the other C-suite people that were involved. So I had the support to do those things, and we started focusing on raising awareness and driving adoption, and putting that formula in place that I'd seen be successful in the past, and it worked. It worked, time after time. You had to adopt somewhat depending on which company we're talking about. But the general strategy of focusing on people and focusing on culture, putting the right comp plan in place, that seemed to work well, and helped us be successful at all three of those players.
I think the culture part is absolutely massive these days. There's some incredible companies out there, and you know, not having that right culture to attract people and develop people seems to be one of the biggest things people are missing. From your perspective, when it comes to culture and what you're trying to build, what do you think the most important factor is?
So you got to drive the right behaviors, and the compensation plan has to be something that is good financially, but also can drive them to want to go out and get new accounts, and get new business and keep that business. That's part of it. You also have to have a culture where people hold each other accountable, where people are constantly learning, where people want to bring out the full potential in everybody else. And so when you have that kind of a culture, and people are constantly pushing each other to learn and develop, I think that kind of creates this environment where everyone's out there trying to help each other out, and nobody wants to leave. I think it's really important that you're building a culture where your best people want to stay and grow with the company. And if you can do that, the other key element is having fun along the way. I was a big believer in doing sales meetings and bringing the leadership team together on a quarterly basis. I think that that interaction in person is really important. I think with COVID, some of the companies have moved away from that, and I think that's a bad decision. I think getting the teams together in person, both the leadership team and then the full sales team, is really important for building that culture and getting people to trust each other and reach out to each other for help.
Okay, very, very nice. Thank you for sharing that with me. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about on the podcast today, and this if you don't mind talking about it, you mentioned that you've not spoke about it publicly on a podcast before, and it was about the day that you left Bardy. I feel like it was quite an important part in your career, and there was some lessons that came with it as well.
Yeah, so it's never easy when you part ways with a company, and so for in that particular day, I was on Sanibel Island with my family, and I remember I went and talked to my wife. It was I can't remember what time it was in the morning, maybe 10, 11 in the morning. And I went and saw my wife, and I said, "Hey, I'm gonna go on a long walk. It's gonna be a while." And I walked out the door, and a couple hours later, or whatever time it was later, I called her. However long it took me to do 10 miles, and mind you, I was in no shape to be doing 10 miles. I was was not training for anything. I'd been running a fairly regular basis, maybe a couple miles, a couple times a week, but was in no shape to do 10 miles. So I went out, partly ran, partly walked, got to 10 miles, called her and said, "Hey, I'm close to doing a half. I'm going to go ahead and do a half marathon." I'd only run once, one half marathon once before, and that was in my 20s, right after college. But I said, "I'm close to doing it. Might as well knock it out. I want to remember this day. I don't want to ever forget it." So along the way, I was calling people on the team, the board members, some of the reps, the leadership, just talking to them about it, about me leaving or parting ways or whatever. And I got to the half marathon point, and I just said, screw it. I've never done a marathon in my life. I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. I don't want to forget this day. And so I ended up doing a full marathon that day. It took me a long time to do it. Again, I was not training for that. I was in no shape to do it, but I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. And so I ended up doing a marathon that day, or 26.2. And the last couple miles, my wife came and joined me on it. And again, took me a long time. I was half running, half walking in the hot sun on Sanibel Island in the middle of summer. So, yeah, I mean, part of that is just to prove that if you put your mind to something, you can do it, and you don't necessarily have to be training for it or in shape to do it. I don't recommend you just go out and run a marathon, but I wanted to prove to myself I could do it. That's the one and only time I've done a marathon. So, yeah, I will never forget that day, and that is something I wanted to remember as inspiration to drive me to do other things, and that's been part of the driver for me to continue to help cardiac startups and founders and do everything I can to help fight heart disease.
I want to try and test your knowledge. Well, I'm not even test your knowledge. I'm going to test your memory here. On that marathon, what was the most memorable call do you think you had on that? There must have been one that still stands out to you this day.
Yeah, so I one of the calls I had was, it probably what helped inspire me to do the marathon. I talked to one of the regional directors. I can't remember if he's still a rep or we promoted him to regional sales director at the time, out on the West Coast. He was telling me about, um, David Goggins and some of the things that David Goggins had done that were just kinda unexplainable, and I think that inspired me to just say, "Screw it, I'm gonna go do a marathon." Some of the things that he had done, really just unexplainable, And I think that was part of the inspiration for it. The other thing was I called, Paula Violette, the ex-COO of Boston Scientific. He was the lead investor in our Series A. He'd been a great was and has been a great mentor to me and someone I've looked up to for a long time, and talked to him about, what I was gonna do next, and I'll never forget, that discussion either. But there were many people I spoke to that day, but those are 2 discussions that really stick out in my mind.
I love that. And what do you think was the biggest driving force for you that day? There must have been something that wanted to keep you going.
I'm a believer in you really should take inspiration from everything, especially some of the negative things or seemingly negative things that happen in your life. And so I wanted this to be inspiration for myself and others, and for others to look at this and say, man, you could have been really upset that day. Instead, you went out and you ran a marathon and you were no shape or were not training to do a marathon. You just went out and did it. And I want that to be an inspiration for myself and for others. And I think that's kind of what drove me, and that's become part of the journey for me. And for people that know me, they'll tell you I'm extremely passionate about innovation in the cardiology and electrophysiology space. And that's kind of what's driven me is you take inspiration from not just the good things, but also the negative or challenging things that happen to you.
That's something I want to talk about. I think the longer I'm in medtech now, the more I see different reasons for being inspired. And I think one of the most recent ones is Arnaud Mascarell from Feinhardt. And he said throughout the podcast, one of the biggest things for him is, it's a commercial game, right? Businesses get bought, there's revenue, items get sold. But for him, he wants to remember how many patients he treated. That is the ultimate end goal for him. Everyone has different reasons and different, goals in this market. What is it that inspires you most?
I think that is also something that drives me when you think about the number of patients. We're constantly looking at that number, and I would use it as a driver for us to drive things commercially. So, for example, at Bardy, our first goal was to get to 1,000 patients a month, and then it was what can we do to get to 5,000 a month, and then it was 10, and then 15, and then 20, and when we eventually got to, I think it was 30,000 patients a month, or can't remember, maybe it was 20,000. Um, it was roughly 30 million in revenue, and that's when we got acquired. But you start to think about how many patients are you treating a year? Is it, and as you get up there and you're doing 20,000 patients a month, that's 250,000 patients a year. You look at what companies today like iRhythm are doing, and they're doing, I think, something like 2 million patients a year. I mean, that's wild to think about a company impacting that many patients, and to have been a part of building those teams and building the early commercial teams that, really kickstarted these companies, and looking at iRhythm, BioTelemetry, and Bardy combined, impacting several million patients a year. That's really, really powerful and something I'm very proud of.
I want to take a minute to say thank you to our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical device development. With deep scientific and engineering expertise, they help medtech teams crack tough development challenges and make the right calls early, reducing rework, delays, and uncertainty later on. Whether you're navigating uncharted technical territory or racing towards market, TTP brings clarity and real-world judgment to the decisions that shape performance, usability, and manufacturability. By retiring risk early and grounding innovation in real-world constraints, they help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that with me. And you work hard. That's no secret. The last three events I've been to, I've seen you at all of them. You're putting some serious miles on the clock. You have a lot of time away from the family.
Yeah.
What is it that inspires that the most then? Because right now you're sitting across multiple boards. There's a lot of plates spinning. There's a lot of things to focus on. What's the North Star for you?
Yeah, so my father-in-law died a sudden cardiac death in the middle of all of this. I had built the two biggest players in the space, or built the teams that built the two biggest players in the space. So this is after, I think I was still at Bardy at the time. I was, because it was Thanksgiving 2016. I'd built, yeah, so I already built iRhythm, already built BioTelemetry, and right, wait a minute, maybe I was still at BioTel at the time. Um, he wasn't feeling well. It was winter 20 or Thanksgiving 2016, and he wouldn't go see a cardiologist. The best thing I could do for him was to get him a live core device. So I showed him how it worked. Said, "Hey, I'm going to buy this for you for Christmas." Bought one for him for Christmas. Sent it to my parents. Well, I had two for my wife's parents. They lived in Arlington, Texas. I forgot to bring it to him on Christmas, and he died of cardiac death 10 days later. So you can imagine my wife and I really felt like we could have done more. We blamed ourselves a bit. And that was really what inspired me when Paul asked me to come do it a third time with Bardy. And then I went and met Gus Bardy and spent some time with Paul and Violet. That was part of what said, you know what, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to fighting heart disease. And I don't ever want anybody I know to experience what we experienced when my father-in-law passed away. It was just a horrible experience going into the emergency room and seeing a family member no longer with us and other family members coming in and realizing that their dad had passed away. It's just an awful, awful feeling, that experience that physicians have to go through all the time, but no one, it's just a horrible, horrible experience. So my thought was anything I could do to prevent that from happening, whether it's helping the other cardiac monitoring companies or other emerging innovations in in the electrophysiology or cardiac rhythm management space that can either treat these patients or prevent them from having some of these issues. I wanted to dedicate the rest of my life to doing that, and that's what really inspires me to keep doing this and work at the pace that I'm working at to help these other companies get there and raise awareness and drive adoption of some of these really innovative emerging technologies.
I'm really sorry to hear about it, Candan. That's truly tough, and I can't imagine how you felt that day. And I think it now makes me realize why you are so inspired, and maybe how much the grief has helped connect you to the work that you're doing. So, thank you very much for sharing that with me, and kudos to what you're doing. He would be very proud of you today. In terms of obviously your career now, then we've touched on what you've done commercially, what you've grown, some acquisitions. What are you currently doing right now? You're sitting across a few different boards. It'd be good to understand
Sure.
what this next phase of play is for you.
Yeah, so I'm now a board member and investor in a handful of public and private company startups, primarily cardiac and EP, electrophysiology, a couple neuro companies. On the public side of things, public companies that I'm on the boards of, a company called Heartbeam out of San Jose, California, a company called Echo IQ out of Sydney, Australia, and a company called Acarix, which is public on the Swedish exchange. And so those are the public companies. There's a handful of private companies that I'm involved with as an investor or board member, companies like Epitel, Happy Tech, Stim Cardio, and a handful of others. And then I'm also a venture partner for a venture fund called Star 51 Capital, which is one of the anchor investors is Mayo Clinic. The other is a major cardiac, Fortune 500 cardiac device company. So that's really interesting. Very involved with HeartX, which is a cardiac focused accelerator that MedAxiom's also involved with, which is owned by American College of Cardiology. I'm on the Innovation Advisory Board of American Heart Association. I've been on the planning committee of HRX from the beginning, which is the Digital Health Summit of Heart Rhythm Society, and then very involved with MedTech Innovator, which is the largest medical device digital health startup accelerator in the world. and judge a lot of the startup pitch competitions, especially that are cardiac ones that are cardiac focused, and really just I love being a part of the cardiac innovation ecosystem and doing what I can to give back to that.
And what day do you sleep on, Ken?
I don't sleep a whole lot, 6 hours a night, but it's I love what I'm doing. I'm having a lot of fun doing it, and hopefully I'm making a difference out there with these companies.
Absolutely are. And, when someone sits across 6 or 7 boards simultaneously, what does your week typically look like?
Very busy. As you mentioned earlier, I like to be out in front of people and meeting with people in person. So conferences like LSI and I've gotten to know people like Scott Pantel and Henry Peck very well, and Paul Grand from MedTech Innovator. I get very involved in those ecosystems. I like to speak at those events, and I find them very impactful from a networking standpoint, both for investors, the startups themselves, and then other parts of the ecosystem that go to those events. So, it varies from week to week, but I would say almost every other week or so, or a couple times a month, I'm flying somewhere in the world to one of these conferences, whether it's a cardiac focused event or a startup pitch event or fundraising event. And I love being out there and meeting with these people and helping them find the right investors, connecting them with strategics, and figuring out what they need to make them successful or scale their companies.
And just what are you targeting? What is your thesis?
Yeah, so with Nelson Jennings Ventures, I'm investing exclusively in cardiac startups, and so if they go through MedTech Innovator or if they're a high potential company for MedTech Innovator and or HardX, I think those are companies that I'm really interested in. My background is on the EP side, both implantables and wearables. So that's kind of my sweet spot. And then also companies that are doing wearable patches in other industries, like for example, Epitel, which is doing or EEG monitoring, so brainwave monitoring. They're the first FDA cleared patches for long-term brainwave monitoring, epilepsy monitoring.
Yep.
Something like that, where it's a patch monitor. There's so much that I've learned having commercialized and built the teams that commercialized three of the four biggest players in the cardiac monitoring front, companies like Epitel. I feel like they're gonna disrupt the EEG monitoring space in a very similar way that iRhythm disrupted the ECG patch monitoring space. So companies like that are of interest as well.
And that's a pretty significant expansion of your thesis. You wouldn't look at Epitello as well, from the outside in, it would look almost, not against what you typically do, but definitely out of your current rhythm. What was it that drew you to them as a business straight away?
So Josh Phillips and Darshan from Catalyst Health Ventures have become friends over the past number of years. And when they started telling me about the company, that's who I learned about it from first. They were looking for a commercial person, and I've helped them recruit James Landis to run commercial. He'd helped me build several companies in the past, first BioTelemetry, then Bardy. He really built the East Coast sales team of Bardy. And so he was a natural fit to run the commercial team at Epitel. So brought him into the mix and then joined the board shortly after. And it just made sense. There's so many correlations between ECG patch monitoring and EEG patch monitoring, and so many learning points that can be applied into that space from the cardiac patch monitoring space. I'm really interested in that space now. I feel like they have tremendous potential, and there's other companies in other areas that have patch monitors that I have interest in, and I'll probably start to get involved with going forward.
Amazing. And one of your board companies that I believe they got FDA clearance in December, Heartbeam. What's the commercialization path for a 12 lead ECG that you can do at home? What does that look like?
Yeah, so their indication right now, their clearance right now is for arrhythmia monitoring for synthesized 12 lead. eventually what they're trying to do is to get heart attack detection. And so if you think about having a credit card sized device in your pocket, wallet, or purse that can do both arrhythmia detection and heart attack detection, just unbelievable. I mean, who would not want to have that in their pocket? Anybody who's had a heart attack would want that in their pocket. Anybody who's at high risk of having a heart attack would want that in their pocket. Any patient who's had um, elucid, clearly heart flow, any of those similar types of tests done, are going to want that in their pocket. And then anybody who has an arrhythmia or suspected arrhythmia is going to want that in their pocket. So it's just an unbelievable evolution to the space and something that you can carry around with you anywhere and then get an on-demand 12 lead. So I have a ton of confidence in that company, and I really look forward to the future adoption and growth of that company.
They certainly do look exciting. And another one that I took a look at on your profile, and I hope you don't mind talking about them,
Sure.
Echo IQ. They've just deployed Mount Sinai.
Yes.
Could you explain what Echo Solve actually does for someone who's never had an echocardiogram?
Yeah, so they take the measurements from the echo, apply AI on top of those, and they're able to detect things like aortic stenosis. So they have FDA clearance for aortic stenosis detection. They can find TAVR patients and other patients that from the echo using AI. They're underway and trying to get clearance on heart failure detection. So they have a study that they just did with Mayo Clinic that came out recently, and you can look at the results of that study. So that's still in the clinical study phase, but they're hopefully going to be able to detect heart failure as well. And there's other things that are in the pipeline as well that I'm not sure if I could talk about publicly yet, but really, really interesting company based out of Sydney, Australia. They have a US based CEO. They're building out the US commercial team. Nick Lubers runs the commercial team. Dustin Haynes is the CEO. I think that company has tremendous potential as well.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing these details with me, and I appreciate you going into the detail. I think one thing I want to speak to you about on the podcast is just because I want to add value to listeners and operators, and one of the biggest things right now is fundraising, as you probably know. It's tough out there. What could early stage companies be doing more of or being more efficient with right now in this market?
I think if they're not going to the LSIs and medtech strategists and medtech world type of events, they need to really start going to those. I think JP Morgan has their healthcare event in January every year. That's kind of the main event, so to speak. But I think that's evolving. I think the LSI events are really, really strong. Second to that, and may even be more impactful for some of these earlier stage startups than JP Morgan, which you can get swallowed up by some of the bigger players that are there versus going to some of these more intimate gatherings and fundraising events. But they have to start going to those events. I think getting involved in accelerators makes a ton of sense. The one you really want to get into is MedTech Innovator. They're the largest in the world. They don't take any equity. They give out all non-dilutive funding. It's really something special. I went through them in 2019 and just had an unbelievable experience. And if you can get into that one, that's probably the best one out there. But I also advise people to not just do one accelerator. Try to get into one of the local accelerators around you, or one of the ones at one of the bigger hospital systems near you. I think doing multiple accelerators you get different things out of. So depending on what stage you're in and what you're doing, consider things like Y Combinator, Techstars. More locally here in Dallas, Health Wildcatters is the one here in Dallas that I'd say would be best for local people here in town.
Okay. And I speak to a lot of people that are and ahhing about MedTech Innovator. So many companies enter it. It's really competitive. What would your advice be to any companies that have either not entered before or are maybe re-entering to hope for a better result this time?
Yeah, I think if you didn't get in once, don't give up. Definitely apply the next year, and it may take you, 3 or 4 times before you get in, and so stay perseverant and persistent, just like you would with anything else there. I think get to know some of the people who sponsor MedTech Innovator. I think having somebody or multiple people on your side that can be a champion for you, with Paul Grand and team and MedTech Innovator, that's always helpful. And then get to know the ecosystem that they've built and the people within it. Anybody that you can get that really believes in your company and can help champion it, that's always going to help you.
Okay. And another question, one of the other common themes I'm coming up with is it looks like the goalposts have slightly moved, especially with Series A funding, right? They want to see earlier data, first in human is becoming ever so more important right now.
Mhm.
With these changes, with how VCs are looking to interact, what would your advice be to any companies that are coming up to that Series A?
Yeah, I think angel investors, family offices, high net worth individuals, those investors become really, really important for the earlier stage startups. More recently, we've been collaborating with a guy named John Slump, who he is a big he really believes in angel investors and focusing on angel investors, and has really helped Stim Cardio, which is formerly known as CardioCare, with their most recent Series A round. And I think that focus on angel investors and family offices is really, really important. And finding people who can help continue to fund people, maybe even longer than you think, before you start to get VCs and strategics involved. So I think really getting to know the angel networks in your area, high net worth individuals and family offices in your area and around the country is really, really important, especially now as you're trying to get funding for those early pilot studies and for your pivotal studies.
And that again comes back to again being visible at these events, right? But outside of attending more conferences and going to LSI, etc., what would your advice be on identifying the right family offices and the right angels for you?
Um, yeah, I mean, I would be out there on social media trying to raise awareness about your company and what you're doing, and doing everything you can to leverage AI and other resources to figure out who the right target angel networks might be, or high net worth individuals or family offices might be, and that focus on your particular area or might have an interest based on a family member that's part of that family office in your particular area.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that with me. I want to talk to you about I want to look forward really. There's been a lot of changes in cardiovascular. There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of buzzwords and exciting areas. There's tons going on. But if you had to put a bet on one area of cardiac care, over the next decade, what would you be going for right now?
So I'm going to talk about two different high growth areas. One, I think wearable therapeutics. So think about this patch monitoring world that is now, or the market that's now finding, monitoring 7 million plus patients a year, finding all these patients with arrhythmia. Now you've got really disruptive emerging innovation like what Stim Cardio is developing, which is a watch that can not only detect arrhythmias but treat AFib and the precursors to atrial fibrillation with neuromodulation stimulation right from a non-invasive wearable watch. That is going to be what disrupts the standard of care in the treatment of cardiac arrhythmias. So technologies like that. The other area, if you think about cardiac patch monitoring evolving into not only cardiac patch monitoring, but vital signs monitoring. So think about heart failure or sleep apnea, where they can diagnose some of these issues and then start to monitor and help manage some of these chronic conditions in cardiac care or overlapping chronic conditions. I think that is where the explosive growth is going to be. You'll start to see things like continuous glucose monitors have other vitals in them, or combining what you get from continuous glucose monitor with things like ECG or other sensors where you can start to manage and predict what's happening way ahead of it happening. So applying AI on top of these vital signs sensors That's going to lead to predictive analytics being applied and preventative medicine. So you're actually going to be able to prevent some of these things from happening, or at least try to drive behavior to prevent some of these things from happening, which is really going to be a phenomenal evolution in the space.
And I would agree there. And what do you think is going to be the biggest roadblock for stopping this? Because it's not a space that I know an awful lot about, if I'm quite honest. So there's got to be a reason why companies haven't pushed through yet.
I think the reimbursement has to evolve as well. I think the remote patient monitoring codes, there's only really one set of codes right now. And so that needs to evolve, and there needs to be better chronic condition management codes. There needs to be variations of the RPM code. So, for example, if you've got, three different vital signs monitors on a patient, there shouldn't just be one reimbursement amount. And if you're managing multiple chronic conditions through some of these devices, which are now only getting reimbursed through the RPM codes, it needs to more fairly reflect the time, energy, that a physician puts into interpreting some of the data and the actions that they're taking, as well as the cost it is to have these monitors on the patient. So that needs to evolve quickly. And I think collaboration between the FDA, payers, CMS, and some of the accelerators and industry trade organizations, that needs to get tighter. You're starting to see that strengthening. As an example of that, this year's MedTech Innovator event, you had Michelle Tarver, who's running the FDA for CDRH, was at the event. You have the woman, April, who runs the TAP program for the FDA, was at the event. And you had leadership from CMS, from Medicare, that was at the event as well. So things like that continuing to evolve and continuing to happen will help drive faster change on the reimbursement front.
So these things have started happening recently, and I think, well, I can quote someone saying this in 2024. You might be able to guess who this was.
Yeah.
It was, "Payers are not reimbursing appropriately. We need CMS in the room and commercial players if AI-enabled devices are going to realize their full value for patients."
Yeah.
Do you know who said that?
Uh, Sounds like something I would say, but I'm not sure who said it.
That was you at LSI 2024, and now it looks like CMS have been more in the room. So who knows? You might have been the domino effect for that. But that's good to hear. And again, there's got to be something else that drives us as well. It's okay having CMS and reimbursement, improving. What else do you think needs to change right now in the ecosystem to see more companies making it?
I think the health economic studies that people are doing, I think that's always helpful. Showing some of the healthcare outcomes that come from using these technologies, that always helps to drive reimbursement change. So part of it is, how do you design the protocol, and what are the actual outcomes of the study? So I think that's important too. Show clinical evidence that you are driving healthcare outcomes, and the reimbursement will follow.
Fantastic. We're coming towards the end of our recording time. I always like to leave with some final bits of guidance, Ken. And what would your advice be to executives that are about to go on that journey where they're deciding they might step onto some boards and they might, get involved in other areas of the cardiovascular market? What would be your biggest piece of advice for people that are about to make that leap?
Yeah, I think it's important you have to show up. You have to go to these events. It's a big time commitment, but if you really want to be successful, you got to show up, and you need to be there, and you need to interact with people, and be able to help drive change, and help make things happen with relationships, and capitalizing on the network that you have. I think always focusing on people and culture is a great idea, and I think you should never stop learning. I'm listening to podcasts every morning. I'm still reading books on habits and daily routines, and everybody does well for a while and then kind of fall off, and kind of you have to dust yourself back off again. Just like in baseball, they have spring training every year. You have to do the same thing for yourself and your personal and professional lives, and is you've got to continuously learn and continuously develop yourself, and don't ever stop doing that. And I think that will better prepare you for whatever you do next, whether it's leaving to join boards or going to help build another company or whatever, wherever your journey takes you in your career.
And there's also bad boards as well. We hear it quite often that, boards have not been getting the value that they want. Well, CEOs haven't been getting the value back from it. What would your advice be to people that want to have serious impact on a board?
Yeah, I think you got to find the right company, the right board. Make sure you're filling a niche. Like, what's a gap that they currently have in their leadership team where you might be able to help fill that gap. I think there are different ways of joining the board. You can either join the board of directors. If you're a physician, join the medical advisory board. Or, I also encourage the startups to have a strategic advisory board too, which could be made up of, a regulatory expert, a commercialization expert, a physician, and then other people who you might need on your team to help fill the gaps that your leadership team has currently. Or if you're about to start commercialization, you want to be more focused on commercializing or adding more of those people to your strategic advisory board or your board of directors. So that there's multiple ways you can get consultants and experts to help your company.
Okay, so ultimately, make sure that they're motivated, right? They've got to find an area that really means something to them, that they know that they want to make a real big difference in.
I think so. Yep.
Amazing. And then, yeah, I think, I can't thank you enough for sharing your story today, Ken. I think you've
Yep.
gave absolute value out to everyone, so I can't thank you again enough. Amazing. Thank you for joining us, Ken.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jordan. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care.